All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for joining us. I know we're going to have some more folks trickling in over the next couple of minutes. I'll take this down here. My name is Chris Neidl. Those of you who are regulars to the show know me as the regular host with my friend Tank Chen, who I'm just going to bring up here because everything's better when Tank is on screen. And this is the latest episode of This is CDR, now deep into the 120s of episodes. We've been doing this for the last 3 years. It was started by Open Air, and the goal of this regular most Tuesday at 12 p.m. Eastern program is, as the name suggests, is we want to be able to show people what carbon dioxide removal is, not in theory, not in big gross raw numbers, but in practice and in the real world. So we have conversations here on most Tuesdays with the doers and innovators who are at the forefront of CDR science, that are heading up startups, that know a thing or two about the emerging area of CDR policy. And through that, as a regular viewer, you hopefully will get a sense of how real world and how evolving of a space carbon dioxide removal is. Tank, how you doing, my friend?
I'm well, thank you, Chris. How you doing?
I'm doing good. Glad we have Cara is going to be joining us in just a second. I'll go ahead and share my screen here again and give a very abbreviated version of my normal spiel, most of which I just covered. This is an open air program. In a few weeks, we have a lot of sessions coming up, but in a few weeks, there'll be some interesting kind of news about open air and some of the changes that we need to make as we've grown, that I'll provide some information, but it's all exciting, good news. But today, incredibly excited for this one for a couple of different reasons. One is, not only are we going to be talking about a really important aspect of carbon dioxide removal, which we call sometimes integration with other sectors or embedding, which really is a key to scale, as our guest today will talk about. It's a way of how do we make CDR a property or a component of, or a value addition to things that already exist in industry. And as today, the survey that you'll get will demonstrate, there's enormous opportunities for this to take place across many, many different sectors. And the other reason why I'm really excited is because our presenter today is not only one of the smartest people who's been thinking and writing about this for quite some time, Cara Maesano, but she is also a very good CDR buddy, just buddy of mine. So any chance that I get to be able to spend an hour with Cara and download some of her insights is time well spent. And I think you will all agree to that as well. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and proceed. I just want to make sure, Cara, if you want to just message me if you're on. I see you're there, but I don't see your camera. We'll put you up in a second, but I'll have Tank go ahead and make the introduction. And Tank, again, after Cara's presentation, we'll just get right into it. But I know you have a lot of thoughts on this too, so we can just have a great conversation about a pretty complicated, broad subject. So don't be shy if anything pops into your head and things you want to raise. Okay?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, it is a very interesting, concept, and it's really not. It is complicated to perform, but I think it's easy to understand, right? And that's what makes it so exciting. Is that you could dream of it, you could think of it, and it is implementable, it is deployable. So
yeah, it's made all the more understandable, which, as I mentioned, because of the work that Cara and her colleagues at RMI have done. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today derives from, I don't even call it a paper. It's really almost like and I hate the word toolkit, which gets overused, but it's this just very practical, functional, basically deck that really lays out many of the different areas that we'll be discussing. So I will drop the link to that paper and highly encourage people to download it. I just used it as a resource this morning in a fact sheet that I was writing. So let me go ahead and shut up and pull Cara up here. Cara, how you doing, my friend?
Good, thanks. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly. So I'm going to jump off. Tank's going to introduce you, and then we'll pull up your slides. And I don't know, Cara, if you were able to upload those slides, we can.
No, but we can try to just.
Okay, you can share your screen. Yeah, you can share your screen if you can do it. Okay, all right, go ahead, Tank, take it away.
All right. So hello, everyone. Well, today we're very excited to welcome Cara Maesano. She was a former guest and a former co-host of This is CDR. And Cara is a leading analyst at the intersection of carbon dioxide removal science and policy. With a background in environmental health science and a PhD from UC Davis in particle physics, her published research has spanned carbon removal, air pollution, and public health. In 2023, she served as a key contributor to RMI's Apply Innovation Roadmap for CDR, helping to shape one of the most comprehensive assessment to date of technical pathway for large-scale carbon dioxide removal. Cara's work focused on embedding CDR in real-world systems, bridging scientific insights, industrial application, and strategic planning to accelerate climate solutions at scale. So Cara, anytime ready, take it away and tell us what that's all about.
Thanks.
And do you want me to help you, Cara, with any slides? Or you all set?
Yeah. Let's see if I can share my screen. Let's see. Let's see.
So just right on the bottom there, the present.
Okay.
There
Yeah. Okay. Can you guys see that?
We can. I'm about to add it. Boom, magic. All right.
Okay.
Now I'll get off.
Okay,
All right.
cool.
See you on the other side, Cara.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for having me on. I want to shout out because I remember the very first one of these. So I wanted to shout out Evan Morton, who did the very first one of these, and then later joined my former team at RMI. So yeah, I'm really excited that this is still going. And thanks to the Open Air team for all the work you've put into this entire series. So I thought today I'm going to be talking about a report that we just put out called Seizing the Industrial Carbon Removal Opportunity. And as was mentioned, this report is about sort of, well, it's about a lot of things. It's about scaling CDR first and foremost, but it's also about how do we get other industries involved in CDR activity? How do we make the case for integrating CDR into some of these larger industries? And when I say larger industries, I'm being really vague and broad because I really do mean like many, many, many different industries, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But yeah, this is work I did while at RMI with Kyle Clark-Sutton and Daniel Pike, and we collaborated with Eli Mitchell-Larsen, who is a Stripe Climate Fellow and co-founder of Carbon Gap. Okay, I'm gonna go to the next slide. So this slide didn't turn out the way I meant it to. There were pictures here. But since this is a CDR show, CDR webinar, I'll sort of tell the story of how we got into this, or how I came to this in the first place. You know, as I see Chris posted our Applied Innovation Roadmap that we did, and looking into the details of each pathway and understanding how they're going to get to scale. And in that roadmap, we looked at 32 different pathways. You start to realize that the resources required to do any CDR at all, you know, if we're going to do this at scale, the resources are quite significant. So I started off thinking about this purely from a resource perspective, like how are we going to have enough rocks or energy or biomass in order to do this? And I put some numbers on here. These numbers are probably wrong, but just to give you a sense of the amount of material it's going to take, or the amount of energy it's going to take to do a gigaton of removal, it's kind of crazy. For geochemical, 1 to 5 might be optimistic. Like we might need even more of that. So if you think about, you know, you want to remove a ton of CO2 using rocks. If that takes 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 gigatons of rock just to remove 1 gigaton of CO2, like that's a lot of it's a lot of processing. It's a lot of transport of heavy material, and it's going to be constraining. If we think about some of the more synthetic or engineered methods that rely primarily on energy, like DAC or some of the electrochemical approaches, that's a lot of energy, and we all sort of know that, and I think we all expect this number to go down. So I'm hoping that this number is incorrect because it's too high. The geochemical number I feel like is incorrect because I think it's too low. At least it's too low right now. And then for biomass, you know, we still need a lot of biomass in order to do this. So if we think about how, like, who has access to all of this material, who has the ability to transport and process all of this material, it's heavy industry. So so that's what led us to that. At first I started thinking about mining because I was thinking primarily about geochemical CDR, but really, you know, this goes for any CDR. Separately, if we've talked to startups about some of their challenges to scale. You know, there are a number of different challenges that startups face. You know, many of you listening might be working on this yourself, so you'll know better than I do, but some of the key themes that were popping up as we were talking to people were access to cheap carbon-free energy, feedstock availability, supply chain integration, partnerships with relevant industries, which is exactly what we're going to talk about, just logistics in general, government support and regulation, permitting, availability of sites, and you know, financing and offtake. So from a startup perspective, we think it makes sense to look straight at industries. I don't know why this is funny. Okay, so yeah, so this is why we think we need to take an industrial lens to CDR. We need billions of tons of feedstock, or, you know, terawatts of energy. CDR needs more on-ramps to pilots and demos to overcome some hurdles to first projects. We, you know, from an industrial standpoint, some of the, you know, a lot of these industries are those that will have a lot of residual emissions that need to be balanced with CDR, but in order to have access to enough supply, they might need to do it themselves. And this is a point, it's a little bit circular in the sense that we think that, you know, some of these industries will need CDR, but there won't be any CDR unless they do it themselves, because there just won't be enough. There won't be enough activity due to resource constraints, and then also, you know, CDR needs to also be reliably delivered, and as we've seen, like, startups are startups, they're young, and they have a lot of challenges to overcome. We think that by partnering with some of these larger industries, there's a better sense, and that the market will feel more comfortable with the uncertainty related to will these credits be delivered or not. So, so we think that the world's largest industries are the most important frontier for carbon removal today. Like I said, mining is a key one, part because they're sitting on all the rock. They have control of a lot of rock, and they know how to process and transport that. So that's relevant for geochemical approaches. But also we're seeing a lot of interesting synergies with wastewater, with construction, pulp and paper, with data centers, the steel industry and aluminum, desalination, agriculture. But there's also shipping. We think that there's overlaps with food and beverage, textiles and chemicals, the energy industry. Somebody also mentioned semiconductors. Any industry that processes a lot of either mineral or water or biomass could be harnessed somehow for carbon removal. So let's move on. So why would some of these industries want to get involved in the first place? So we think that there's this commercial imperative for them to do so, and then there's a climate imperative. And depending on your viewpoint, you can start with one or the other. The climate imperative is basically that we need billions of tons of CDR annually by 2050. We need access to billions of tons of resources to do this, as I mentioned. We also need to pick up the pace on piloting of CDR approaches, and we need a reliable path to scale. And that's all needed in order to avoid some of the worst tipping points due to climate change. But if you're an industry, you might have other priorities. And so we wanted to also outline some of the commercial imperatives as well. Some of that is just new revenue streams. So new revenue streams could be maybe you could supply carbon credits depending on the carbon accounting and how that all works out. But maybe you can sell your product for a green premium, for example. And maybe it's not necessarily new revenue streams, but maybe you're saving money because you get to avoid carbon taxes because you have lower net emissions, for example. We think that industries who take on CDR will be able to stay competitive, in part because they will have stronger community support, but also if they are under any kind of compliance, either now or in the future, they may be struggling with the costs of emitting so much. In some industries, depending on the industry, there's a lot of waste that could be turned into value. And that's not always as easy as it sounds, but there are a lot of waste feedstocks that are applicable to carbon removal approaches. Many industries have corporate net zero goals that they'll need to reach. And if they can't buy CDR because it's too expensive or because it's not available, they might be able to do it themselves. Improving regulatory compliance, this goes for both emissions, but also for environmental compliance, depending on what it is that they do. So if your waste are environmentally problematic and you spend a lot of money trying to mitigate those, you might be able to use some of those waste or do something else such that you improve your environmental footprint and also your compliance. And then finally, we think that given all of this and given the changes, that industries would be better off they might prefer to be involved in some of these early conversations on how this works, how the carbon accounting works, rather than sit on the sidelines and have all of those things decided for them. Oops, just a second. Okay. So yeah, so we see this diagram's a little bit hard to process, and apologies for that. It's in our report. We think that there are a number of different synergies between industries and carbon removal. So the most obvious one is using industrial waste as inputs to CDR processes, and there's some examples listed here. So mine tailings and waste rock, slags and brine, waste heat, or biogenic carbon in water, and that biomass, bioslurries, things like that. So those can be fed into a carbon removal process, but sometimes carbon removal processes also produce things that can be used, such as if you look to the left, I have carbon-based products. So carbon-based products can be mineralized aggregate or biochar, for example, or building materials. And those things have value by themselves, which means that you're not just doing carbon removal, you're also producing something that somebody else wants. Sometimes there are byproducts to the carbon removal. So critical minerals, if you're processing some of these ex situ mineralization techniques, can also pull out critical minerals. And there are a couple examples, such as Xterra and travertine. They work on that. Some carbon removal processes produce acids that can be used. Also, travertine is a good example there. Some produce hydrogen. And then, when we're looking at carbon storage, there are some examples where like in desalination, for example, people are starting to use brines as a means to store CO2 directly in the brine. So there are some options as well there. But also we think that it could be beneficial, even if there aren't direct overlaps, to insert a CDR process into an industry or to make use of waste, that they could also just share infrastructure. And these can be things like stranded assets, like old ships, for example, or old oil and gas infrastructure. But also, I think the team at Heriot-Watt produced a paper looking at the liming industry and calciners, and they're not used 24/7. So when they're not using it for their own activity, maybe they could use those things in service of CDR. So we think that industries can play many different roles in CDR. We kind of broke them down. One is just, we said resource and infrastructure provider. What we mean by that is they can if the CDR industry is growing, somebody's going to need to sell them stuff. So just as a supplier of things, of feedstocks or materials, we think that as CDR grows, some of these industries can be helpful there, but more exciting are other roles, such as that of an investor. So some of these companies are starting to invest in CDR for multiple reasons. We think that these industries could be partners to startups and work with them. We also think that some of these companies could just do the CDR themselves. We don't necessarily want to bypass some of the innovation taking place within startups. But in a lot of cases, industries could in theory, do some of this themselves. And then game changer is a bit of a tricky one to explain, but we also are going to need, we're going to need some big influential, I don't want to say lobbying because I don't necessarily mean lobbying, but we're going to need some support from some major industrial players in order to get more attention globally to CDR. So we think that if industries have a stake in CDR for one reason or another, either they've invested or they're developing projects with or without partners, that they could be a driving force in order to implement policy changes and get things moving, basically. So I have one example here looking at how an industrial site can also be a hub, like a CDR hub. Because in some of these cases, there are in some cases, there's like one very obvious way that a CDR process can integrate into an industry. But in some cases, there are lots of ways to do CDR on an industrial site. And this opens up opportunities for hubs. Here is just a cartoon example of all the different types of CDR we could do on a mine site. So we tend to think about the mine tailings first and the waste rock, and that we can mineralize it, or even maybe use it for enhanced weathering, depending on the situation or how you're doing the enhanced weathering. But actually, there's all sorts of things you could do on a mine site. I know there are teams like a quarry who are looking at doing mineralization in pit lakes. So pit lakes are former mining pits that have filled with water. You could, nothing's living really in there that you want. And so you could do CDR there. Thanks for posting the link. You, of course, can mineralize mine tailings or extract metals, but I know there are teams also looking at doing biomass burial inside former mine shafts. In some cases, you may be able to store carbon, CO2 that you've collected on site, say, for example, from DAC. The issue there is that, some of these sites are quite isolated and maybe you don't have energy to do DAC. But if you can get around that problem, there's no reason why you can't put direct air capture on a mine site. And then, many mine sites already do a lot of reforestation, though in that case, I'm not sure that counts as CDR. So that's another topic. Okay, so I'm coming to the end. We've sort of just listed some items. How can industries support carbon removal? If there are any industries listening, there are a number of different ways, and we break it down in the report. But what are the different opportunities for your business? Can you invest in research or development, or even do a demonstration scale project on site on any of your sites? Creating separate goals for decarbonization and carbon removal can go a long way. And we'd also like to see industries help develop markets and create demand. So I'll end there. And just to say, I talked about our main report, and the QR code for that is here. But we also have, this report is part of a series, and the first of the series is looking at biomass residue building products. The second in the series came out end of last week on desalination. And then we've got a third one looking at opportunities in wastewater, and that'll come out later this summer. So I will stop sharing.
Awesome. It's all set.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much, Cara. Really appreciate it. It's a huge subject to go over. And one thing I will say, maybe I'll have you back as our third member of the hosting team, because I think I told you starting not next week, but the week after, we're going to do a series on wastewater treatment and CDR in a pretty creative way. We might bring on Eli and some other wastewater treatment CDR people and really take a deep dive into that. But I think so much to discuss here, because it is the resources that have been produced, and I'll try to multitask and grab the desalinization and the other papers as well. Let's do this first, because we always do this, but I think yours is particularly interesting because I was sort of part of it. You and I have known each other for a while, and I always describe CDR as this interesting motley crew of people who almost all at the same time came from different fields, or like they found out about it, like, I have to do that, and they just made their way into it. And I think you have one of the more sort of colorful, interesting backgrounds. So it's always useful for people who come on the show to share a little bit about their journey into CDR. So let's start with that.
Yeah. Oh God. Where do I start? My background is in physics. So I studied cosmology and then particle physics. And then after that, I ended up working on air pollution and environmental exposures, and how they impact public health. A lot of that work bled into a lot of air pollution assessment, but a lot of that work bled into climate and public health, and how climate change is impacting public health across a variety of different dimensions. And that's actually a pretty depressing topic. I urge everybody to look into it because it's pretty motivating, I guess. It was motivating for me anyways to leave the field and start working on solutions. And I had started thinking about carbon removal in like the weirdest way. And I think that's what you want me to talk about. I started thinking about it partly because I was thinking about how a lot of air pollution generally gets measured by particle counts. So if you're trying to do real-time measurement, you've got a sensor that's looking at like how many particles do I have that are this size or smaller, and that doesn't really tell you much about what that is. Oh, I see Dana's on. Hi, Dana. I just saw you said the thing. Exciting. So they don't really tell you. Air pollution sensors don't really tell you what's in there. You can if you do it differently, but if you want like a real-time sensor, it's not going to tell you. So I was trying to think about how, I don't know that this would work at all, and I never ever tested it, and I can think of reasons why it probably would not work at all. But I was thinking about how in my PhD, I was studying how cosmic ray muons come down, they interact with carbon atoms actually in our detector, and then they react and they mimic the neutrino signals that we were actually looking for. But cosmic rays are coming down all the time and they're interacting all the time. So I don't know exactly how cosmic rays interact with air pollution, but my sense was, and I know this is being recorded, so I'm a little bit nervous talking about it. My sense is that you could probably use those to understand what it is they're interacting with by looking at the energies that you would measure in order to do that. So yeah, I was thinking about that, and is that even a thing that you would want to try to do? But then I was thinking, wait, my PhD was looking at cosmic ray muons coming in and interacting with carbon atoms and changing them into lithium atoms. for a split second. They changed them to lithium ions, and then they lithium isotopes, and then those decay very quickly. And then, but I kind of realized, I was like, wow, like I'm doing all this stuff on air pollution and health, but I don't really like the data. Also, I didn't like the data I had access to because it wasn't as rigorous as the particle physics data. But also, I was like, why am I not thinking about changing, about what I was thinking about before, like cosmic ray muons and shifting carbon into lithium? Like that is not a thing that is ever going to happen, by the way. We can't change carbon into lithium, not in any way that would help anybody, because it decays super, super fast. But sorry, the point of the story. The point of the story is that I realized, like, I don't know how carbon gets changed into anything else, anyways. And how do people change carbon? Like, why would they change carbon into anything else? I mean, I knew it was a problem.
If I had a nickel, Cara, for everybody who has this exact same story, I would be a wealthy man.
Yeah, the point is that like I realized I didn't know anything about carbon removal and I needed to learn. And then I started learning, and then I just went down rabbit hole after rabbit hole, and I am still going down rabbit hole after rabbit hole.
Well, you're going down really, really important rabbit holes, and I think this one is becoming less of a rabbit hole and more of a paradigm, I think, for really thinking about carbon removal, about how we fit this into what all the stuff that we have to do by 2050 and after. And so I wanted to kind of start with that just from a principles one, and then we can, again, very much encourage people to look at the resources. I am so excited for that wastewater treatment one, which is kind of a sibling of the industrial paper that came out in April. But for me, as a guy who came from renewable energy, I say that almost every episode, and worked on batteries and solar in different parts of the world, and then moved over, there was always this question of, we had to make carbon removal register as something that was urgent and necessary by saying, oh my God, we have to do this. We have to do a lot of it, and we have to do a lot of it by this date. And if we quantify that as a rule of thumb, it's basically the size of the oil and gas industry, right? So that's a good way to get people's attention. Not a great way, it turns out, to get people to sort of hop to and say, all right, let's do it, because it's very, very daunting, right? And so for me, when I think about it, where people used to talk about renewables, well, at least that produces something of value that we need, and the same with e-mobility. There was always this problem of, is this just some extra thing we have to do that doesn't, add other value? Right. And when I think of that oil and gas sort of reference point, I think the better way to think about it is not another industry like oil and gas, but how do we use existing industries where we make carbon removal a function or a property of those industries? And that's how we're going to get this done. And to me, I think that is again, a paradigm for us to think about. Do you agree with that? Does that kind of sum up the sort of the gist of this?
Yeah. No, that's I like how you put that, actually. Yeah, like there's no way. So I showed, for context, I showed the slide of how much rock do we need to do a gigaton of CDR. The coal industry, on average, moves around about 8 gigatons of material per year. So if we want to do, and that might be like 1 gigaton of CDR. So that means if you reach the size of the coal industry today, you might get to do 1 or 2 gigatons of CDR with that rock. So, and that's not enough, right? Like that's not 5 to 10. It's definitely not 10 to 20, which is probably closer to what we actually need if we want to stay within carbon budgets, or we're not staying within carbon budgets. I shouldn't even say that. If we want to like really make sure we can come down from overshoot, like we probably need much more CDR than 5 to 10 gigatons by 2050, because yeah, I can talk about that later.
But I think, Cara, even just on that point, when I hear 1 to 2 gigatons from that mass transfer that you talked about, that's awesome, because it's not the only thing that we can achieve CDR through. And I think even the map that you just showed, the little graphic of mining, there's many different forms of CDR that either plug in on site or up or downstream, production of it. So a 1 or 2 return on that, particularly when you calculate the co-benefits of soil enrichment, that to me is actually a pretty encouraging number, I would say. But I don't know if you share that view.
Yeah, maybe. But I mean, even that's going to be hard, right? Because it's not just material, right? That's not the only constraint that you have. So, but I do agree that we need all the methods. Like, we're going to need all the methods. We're probably going to need methods we've never even thought of. Dust some like bad ideas off the shelf and see if now we can make them work, but also things that nobody on this call knows about. Hopefully, there's more innovation going on. But yeah, to your point, I think there are very few people who want to pay for CDR for its own sake. Like, it has to do something else. And in order for some of these larger industries to get involved, which we need them to get involved, people are trying to get them involved as buyers, right? Like, there's been a big push to get a lot more buyers into the market, but just in general, like they need a compelling reason to do it, and it has to fit strategically into whatever it is that they're doing. And there needs to be co-benefits, there needs to be additional value, because as you mentioned, like people are happy to pay for energy because they need energy, but no one likes paying for waste management unless you're used to it or you can see the waste itself. So
yeah, we do have, there's a couple things I want to get into, and what I'll probably do is Katie in the comment section has asked a lot of good questions, and I might sort of melt them in to our conversation right now rather than taking each one. And Tank, do jump in here if you have any of your own questions as well. But I think when you kind of portray in the abstract sort of that, 2 things really leapt out from your presentation, I think, is that when you lay those, what are the sort of value propositions that an industry can sort of potentially look forward to or seize upon by participating in it? That they might be able to actually incorporate CDR itself in their material or product, or this might be a way in which they can avoid carbon taxes or comply with an ETS. We already, as we mentioned a couple of weeks ago in the Brazil ERW episode, carbon removal was centrally included as a compliance option under Brazil's new ETS, which just passed in December. And that there also might be a business opportunity because they actually already do stuff that's part of the value chain of CDR. And then the other thing you mentioned, which is really interesting, is if those are compelling cases that industries actually bite on, then they are the game changers. That it's not this thing where you might have allies in these other industries that see a real business opportunity. I'm thinking this every day around COP30. That then they become part of the coalition to actually make it happen. Do you see among the different industries that you've outlined here, where do you see the first takers on this, or where are there sort of bright sparks or signs in the market that there are industries that are starting to engage in this way? I have a few that I'm thinking of, but I'm curious from your view what you see.
Yeah, I'll share mine, and then you can share what you're looking at. Yeah, so the mining industry is exploring and taking this. I think they're taking this seriously. I think they are aware of the challenges, and so they're not jumping all over it necessarily, but they are aware, and they are the mining industry, the mining companies that we've talked to are. I mean, they know full well that they can carbonate their material. It's not top priority for them, of course, because their priority is supplying minerals and things, right? But that's one. Wastewater, from what I gather, wastewater and desalination plants are, I don't know about all desalination plants, but I know the Capture 6 project in Korea, I think it's called Project Octopus. They get extra water out from Capture 6's process. So
yeah,
like that's a benefit for them. I think there are other ways that wastewater treatment plants can benefit by including CDR, and that's, there are teams working on like sort of outlining specifically what those ways are. Our report was very high level, so that's why I'm not providing a lot of detail. I mean, we took a very broad, high level brush, and then some of the more details are in the specific reports. And then we do have a mining roadmap that will come out later this year.
great.
That like looks more at mining, and it's a little bit more of a how-to guide than the other ones. But yeah, I think those two industries are key. The construction industry, concrete, like you probably know more about that than I do.
It's my obsession. Yes.
Yeah. And it's just like, I think there are other ones too. I hear people, I haven't talked to anybody in the textile industry, but like that's come up. So, they process quite a lot of water and biomass. So.
Yeah, I'm just going to list off a couple too. Tank will be interesting, in the land of semiconductors too. Tank's based in Taiwan. Just recently, there's been really interesting conversations about, integration there. But I think, and to kind of speak to some of Katie's questions too, is with mining. Let's take mining. Mining is one of the record of, environmental damage, and particularly for indigenous populations, is tragic, high magnitude, and ongoing, right? So when we talk about CDR, never, just take it as a rule of thumb, at least as far as we stand, and I think the carbon rule community, it's never a get out of jail free card on all of the things that industry must be accountable for, right? And that's even, in fact, including CDR into formal compliance structures is the best way to ensure that won't happen. But I think for mining, you have things like the waste stream, as you said, mine tailings, some of the research that's been done on that too. If you carbonate it, it makes mine tailing batches even more stable and reduces the risk of terrible disasters like we had in Brazil just a few years ago that killed over 200 people. But you also have even more directly the mining of these materials themselves. They're actually mining basalt and other ultramafics in Brazil and in Australia and other places like this. So it's already part of their direct business, in addition to the other things that you mentioned. So that's one of the most multifaceted, I think, examples. But I think also with wastewater treatment, and I'm not going to get into it in great depth right now because we're going to do a whole series on this starting in 2 weeks, is that you have this stacking of applications from integrated ERW, from taking biosolids, turning it into biochar. They can then be used in concrete, ocean alkalinity enhancement. They can be done in parallel. They're not mutually exclusive, and they're tied to other problems that those places are trying to solve, whether reducing their tipping fees or eliminating PFAS, right? So that's another very vivid example of it. And we could go on and on. My last one I'll say, Cara, that is really starting to get some buzz around it because it's got, data centers in AI, right? These are facilities that are somewhat have a free lunch right now because when a lot of the cap and trade and ETSs were developed, they were not sort of covered facilities under that, but the day is coming where they're going to be more regulated. Their biggest problem is cooling. That's their largest operating expense. And if you could have applications that link direct air capture to that can actually take the waste heat, pull it out of those facilities and use it to drive carbon dioxide removal while reducing the energy cost of those facilities, that's a real win-win. And some of the operators of that are some of the very same tech companies that have been some of the earliest supporters as buyers of CDR. So that's just to kind of triangulate between very old incumbent, extraction industries, between the newest things ever, like AI and data centers, we can see real applications. And then wastewater treatment, one of the most ubiquitous pieces of infrastructure in the world, over 5,000 wastewater, 60,000 wastewater treatment facilities, in the world right now. So anyway, just wanted to paint a little bit more of a picture.
Yeah. And then also, Katie, to address your question. So on greenwashing, for me, this is about like cleaning, industries need to clean up after themselves. Everybody needs to clean up after themselves. I don't think anybody gets, personally, I don't think anybody should get a pass, but everybody's been getting passes. And now we have this problem where we have like all this excess CO2 in the atmosphere, along with like a million other pollutants, in the environment in different ways. So for me, this is about not being messy, I guess, if I can put it that way, not polluting. So in terms of like, it's not just greenwashing their operation. For me, if a company were to say, I could clean up, but I'm not, I'm just going to buy cheap offsets and pretend like that's equal. That to me is like clear greenwashing. But if they were to go into it and say, okay, you know what, I can use some of this messy stuff to clean up this other mess that I've made, I think that we need to not only support that, but like actively encourage it. I don't think there are that many industries that deliberately try to hurt the environment. I think they're doing what they, well, I don't know. I can't really speak for industries, but I will say, I think there are a number of them that are actively trying to figure out how to be greener. And this offers them another set of solutions. And then I was going to say one other thing about this. In some cases, like in wastewater, for example, wastewater is in the business of cleaning up our mess, right? Like they clean up after us. And so for an industry like wastewater to include CDR, in some sense, you're like, well, they're processing waste anyways. They can process more waste, CO2 waste. But they're also not like polluting necessarily. They are cleaning up our mess, like human messes, right? So I don't think we should be treating each industry the same. Like cement and concrete, like emissions are just a result of the process, not a result of fossil fuel extraction. And then there's like a number of different like differences between industries. So I think we have to treat them all a little bit differently. I do like your idea of transitioning oil and gas to CDR only, because that would be great. Like that's what we want them to do, right? We don't want them to be oil and gas companies anymore. We want them to do something positive.
I was going to make that distinction, which is an important one, is that this is not about maintaining the status quo across all these industries that allows them to function as they currently do. And I think you have to, one of the things that was such a big sort of like whiplash for me when I moved from solar into CDR, but particularly into concrete and cement. I worked on legislation for that for LRDC. I have, up until recently, even is that there's a very different set of expectations we should really have with that. I've looked at this and we're just not getting rid of concrete in any meaningful time frame for climate action. In fact, we're going to be making dramatically more of it, particularly in the global South, right? I don't have the same outlook, and I'm not alone on this. And this is probably something that many people in our field think, is that we need to stop taking oil and gas out of the ground and we need to replace it with other things. And so every one of these industries has a sort of a different future before it in terms of what we should have for expectations. And so when you take the example of oil and gas here, there might be short-term integration things, potentially that work with those operations. But I'm more interested in what is all of the capital, human, technological, that is invested in oil and gas, and how does that translate into things that we need to do for carbon removal, not necessarily as part of oil and gas operations. So anyway, that's the point, is that every industry you look at, you have to kind of think about what are the ones we're trying to sunset and get rid of as fast as possible, which are the ones that we have to evolve and transform because they're essential and there's no other alternative for it. And, you know, I think you would probably agree with that, Cara. It's not a formula that applies to all of them. It's really, you have to look at each industry on a case-by-case basis.
Right. And then some of them, like wastewater, but also desalination, like as climate change gets worse, as populations grow, like we are going to need more fresh water. So those industries are expected to grow. Like wastewater, not everybody processes wastewater, and you end up with like environmental issues and health issues in different parts of the world. So we want more wastewater processing, but we want to do it in a way that's not, you know, causing more harm somewhere else. You know, same with desalination.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we're just about out of time. And Katie, I would say these are great questions and ones that are very much top of mind for all of us. And right now, literally for me, with the work I'm doing with the Climate Champions. Feel free to please do hit me up on LinkedIn. Would love to find out more about your work and continue the conversation. Cara, thank you so much. I know you had a busy day. We're running around before you came, and a very huge, multifaceted body of work to try to render in a short hour. I mean it sincerely that I would love to have you tag along for the wastewater treatment, or to the extent if we do ones on desalination, I always say desalination later on, I would love to be able to just kind of tag you in to be another head that sort of interprets the conversation and contributes to it. So thank you so much for joining.
Absolutely.
And
thank you for having me.
No problem. When does the next report come out again?
Sometime this summer.
Okay, very cool.
Sometime this summer. I will post on LinkedIn when that happens. Also, if anybody has any questions for me or wants to get a hold of me, you can find me on LinkedIn. The only Cara Maesano on the planet, I think. So it's easy enough.
There's only a couple of Chris Nidals out there as well. But anyway, thank you so much, Cara. Really appreciate it. So I'll just give people a little bit of news about our upcoming one. I'm going to have, for first time in quite a long time, very soon on our Luma, you will see multiple This is CDRs. We're always kind of just behind the next week. We are going to do that series. We have a couple of DAC ones coming up that are really interesting because they're very different kinds of DAC that are very industry integrated. So we're going to start that off next week. I'm really, really excited. We have Elena Nikonova from Skytree. Skytree is one of the original DAC companies that commercialized. They've been around for a long time, and it's been incredibly interesting. They have this formula, very modular direct air capture, and to be able to apply it to different industries. And that is starting to pay off in kind of interesting ways. And so next week, Elena's going to be here, and she's going to particularly talk about the way in which they're integrating with utility scale renewable energy plants in Texas and hopefully other places. They have a really exciting announcement earlier this year of a project they're going to be doing in Texas. And so that really, through the lens of what we discussed today, this definitely falls in that category. So do join us for that. And then again, after that, starting that, we're going to begin a series focused on wastewater treatment, which can be sort of standalone because those solutions aren't always applied to wastewater. And that will all culminate in an interesting finale where we're going to kind of look at one particular wastewater treatment plant as a sort of an example of where these apply. And that's Newtown Creek here in New York City, where I'm from and live currently. And hopefully we're going to have representatives of the sponsor of city council legislation that is aiming to study the potential to do carbon removal through wastewater treatment. So these will all be sort of standalone, but then we'll kind of take together what we've learned with them and sort of think, how could this potentially apply to one particular wastewater treatment plant? And by doing that, I think there'll be more general lessons that are learned. So stay posted for that. But thank you, everybody, for joining. And we'll see you next week with Skytree. See you.